Hello, everyone. If you could take your seats, then we can begin. Señoras y señores, bienvenidos. Welcome to the latest event from the CGD's Latin America initiative. Thank you for joining us here. We're also live streaming, so people may well be watching in different locations as well. Bon dia to those, buenos tardes, if they're in different time zones as well. My name is Rajesh Merchandani. I'm the new Director of Communications here at CGD, and it's a great pleasure to have this as my first event here at CGD. I'm very happy to host. You know that we have 4 renowned speakers. Many of you will know them and their work already. They're all here to reflect different aspects of the title of today's event, which is From Macro to Micro. How ready is Latin America for tougher times ahead? Why are we asking this question? Well, because slower growth is predicted for the region across all aspects of their economies. So how ready, how resilient, how prepared, how insulated are they for potential slower times in the years ahead? My colleague at CGD, Senior Fellow here, Liliana Rojas Suarez, will begin. She'll be talking from a macroeconomic perspective, and she'll also be introducing a new tool that she's developed to gauge how resilient countries are against future shocks. It's a way to compare countries and compare each country's performance with history and now. After Liliana, Augusto de la Torre will take the stage. He's the chief economist at Latin America and Caribbean section of the World Bank. He will be challenging the neoclassical view about savings by suggesting that savings can impact on growth and discussing how exactly. After Señor de la Torre, we'll hear from Santiago Levy, who's the vice president of the Inter-American Development Bank. He's looking at the past history of productivity factors in Latin America, especially compared to other regions, other more successful regions of the world, asking what has Latin America been doing and what does it need to do if it wants to be as, say, competitive or productive, as successful as South Korea, for example. And then our last speaker will be Professor Nora Lustig, who's a professor of Latin American economics at Tulane University in New Orleans, and of course a non-resident fellow here at CGD. And she will be looking at the issue of redistribution, inequality, and economic growth. This is the micro in our title. What policies should governments be pursuing, adopting, if they want to reduce inequality and spur economic growth? So that's how we go from macro to micro. Each speaker will give a presentation for between 10 and 15 minutes, after which time there will be some space for questions. Speakers, it's great to have you here. Thank you very much. As you know, people are extremely keen to hear you speak and even more keen to ask you questions. So with that in mind, I would ask you, please, 10 to 15 minutes, with a maximum of 15 minutes. We do want to leave at least 30 minutes for questions at the end, and we do need to be out of here by 12 o'clock. So with that, welcome and a little warning to our speakers. I'll invite my colleague Liliana Rojas Suarez to give us our first presentation. Thanks, Liliana.
Good morning to all. Thank you for being here. Okay, as Rajesh just said, my role is to start with the macro global picture and where does Latin America turn. And so, of course, we need to put things into the overall context of what has been happening. And the way I see it is that basically large vulnerabilities in the world have been migrating starting from the crisis in the United States that started in 2008. I always have a problem with this. I can never get there. And I'm not getting there. Okay. To Europe, and we know that the epicenter took place in 2011. And then, as you know, China has started to have a significant number of problems. And from there, the effects of Europe as well as China is impacting other emerging market economies. And the concern starts with the Fragile Five: Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, India, and Turkey. But we don't know which way this is going in terms of effect and how the whole economy is going to be moving on. What we know, however, is that after the crisis, there was an overall sense of optimism, right? The crisis was going to last very long. These are forecasts for the GDP growth, and the different lines reflect the time you were on. The truth is that if you were in 2010, the IMF saw the recovery is going to come very fast. Soon we're going to go back to the path of growth that we had before. But little by little, and if you have the time, you're going to notice that as going downwards, the projections becomes lower and lower and lower in such a way that the lowest line, the dotted red line, is what the forecast for 2015-16 are, both for the growth economy and for emerging markets. And sadly enough, Latin America is the one where forecasts have been the most downgraded. And the way you can see it is by looking at the numbers in the vertical axis. We're talking here ones and two. We're here talking about in overall emerging market 4.5 or 3.5 for the world economy. So even though the baseline scenario that used by consensus and the multilateral financial organizations basically is quite optimistic. It assumes that interest rates are going to increase slowly, well-controlled, anticipated, gradual. Europe does not fall back into a prolonged recession. There is no financial crisis in China, and the geopolitical crisis in Russia is contained to the region and is to a certain countries, but really does not affect the emerging market class. In this scenario, is my view that there are what I call three underpriced risks that affect Latin America, and I'd like to tell you about them. The first one is the temporary creation of liquidity. I'm going to explain the three of them. The second one is an overconfidence position by investors that they could actually reverse their positions very quickly. And the third one is the larger than expected deceleration in China. So let's go one by one. The first one is what I call the temporary creation of liquidity. Why is temporary and why I'm talking about liquidity? Because at the time of the global crisis, many assets from developed countries were actually destroyed. Assets that were AAA no longer were AAA. You know about all about that. But then what do you do when you have trillions of dollars in investment funds that have to go somewhere? Well, if you combine that with a very low interest rates in the advanced economies, the obvious move is going towards emerging markets. And I'm calling it temporary because it did not came about because suddenly emerging markets become better places to go, but because the situation in advanced economies became worse. So if the cycle turns, as I call my presentation, then the probability of a move out of emerging market increases. And the other factor that happened was that increased regulations to banks created a shift. Investors, rather than, borrowers, rather than borrowing from banks, raised funds through issuing in the international capital markets via bonds. And that is actually what has been happening very strongly, both for banks and corporations from Latin America and all emerging markets. This is a very telling graph. The dark green lines, as well as the dark pink, are the issuance of external bonds by Latin American corporations. Compare the dip of those green, dark green and dark red with before the crisis, with 2006, 5, 4. They are much smaller, right? I mean, in the period after the crisis, it was much larger. Now, something interesting is that before the crisis, the soft pink, which is loans by banks, is much larger. So the shift occurred from borrowing from international banks to issuing bonds in the international capital markets. And something that is of concern to me, since I'm always very interested in the financial sector, is that this didn't also happen, the issuance of bonds didn't happen only by corporations. It also happened by banks. So these are the issuance of bonds just by banks that are under the supervisory purview of Latin American supervisors. And in some countries, like especially Brazil, these large issues of bonds have been accompanied by an increased reliance in wholesale funding, meaning that banks have decreased, in Brazil in particularly, their funding, the relative funding, is supposed to be very safe if you actually increase the deposits, deposit taking, if you fund yourself via deposits. But if you do it by what is called wholesale funding, which means basically everything that is not deposits, then risk increase. Well, in the Brazilian banking system, the ratio of deposits to wholesale fundings, the ratio of deposits to wholesale fundings have decreased. Second, under price risk too, is that investors seems to be very confident that all the investment, all those trillions of dollars that have gone to emerging markets, the moment interest rates increase in the US or they feel that some risk really strong occurs, then there's going to be a reverse with no problem. And that's reflected in some perceptions about risks. But this actually is a concern because investors, what the Fed is doing these days, and yesterday there was another announcement, is basically create a security blanket for investors. Yellen is expected to be told to investors when interest rates are going to increase. If you do that, basically you're providing a guarantee. You're saying, okay, don't worry, I'm not going to increase the rates until I tell you, so you can go ahead with risk-taking. And the last underpriced risk is China. And in the case of China, we don't have to expand too much, but again, my concerns go beyond just the slowdown in economic growth. Is the fact that on the right, you can see that the price of new construction is coming down significantly, but most importantly, there has been a huge rapid growth in local government spending in infrastructure projects with little productivity. And the combination of those two things could be a significant risk to the stability of the financial system because it has been banks that have been undertaking all this lending. That means that if we are talking again about the leverage problem in China, over-indebtedness in China, well, they have to correct it, and they are doing so through the leveraging. But the leveraging, of course, implies a number of consequences to that, which one of them, of course, is a slower growth, and both commercial and financial impacts. The commercial effects, we all know, I mean, through trade and effects on the fiscal because of the decline in the commodity prices. But again, focus on financial effects. One very important risk that I'm concerned about is that China was one of the reasons why people start talking about the emerging markets as an asset class. Before, emerging markets were not an asset class, but the rise in China gave a lot to talk about emerging market as an asset class. If that reverses, if the China, we are there to lead the emerging market class, there could also be a significant questioning about the way to go for emerging markets. I don't have time to go through the many specific risks that I was going to discuss for Latin America. So what I'm going to briefly take you, these are different indicators of what I used to construct what I call an index of resilience. And it's basically, I consider that an economy is more or less resilient to an external shock, depending on two factors. The first factor is, well, if a shock hits you, how strong are you to receive it? And the second factor is, how strong are you in terms of your authority or in terms of your policymakers' capacity to undertake countercyclical fiscal and monetary policies? So on the first side, on how strong are you, the first thing you have to look at is, well, how is your current account, right? Because that's a flow indicator of external vulnerability. If you have a lot of financing needs, you're going to be more susceptible to the impact of a shock. And what are your debt indicators, your external debt indicators? You have large amounts of external debt to GDP. Is your external debt very or highly short-term maturity? So putting all those variables together, and there is a paper out there that has everything, so I don't have to explain this to you. This is the way the indicator looked in 2007 for 21 emerging market economies. So the first are Latin America, the others are emerging Asia, and the others are emerging Europe. Why 2007? Because the question is, imagine that you were in the year 2007 and you just use available indicators and calculate this in the available data and calculate this indicator and rank countries to see whether relative to each other, which are more vulnerable and which are more strong. And actually, the indicator provides very solid results. The list, the country ranking is to the right, and is the only number you really need to be looking at. The emerging Europe are the countries that are the most vulnerable in 2007, and that's what happened in 2008. Among emerging market economies, emerging Europe was the region most affected. Latin America is in the middle of Asia and emerging Europe. Emerging Asia in general, I don't have time to go into country by country, but emerging Asia was the strongest, the most resilient. And then came in the middle Latin America, with actually Chile, according to this ranking, being the strongest. Okay? So that was in 2007. So now I ask the question, if it works well for the crisis of 2008, what happens if I do the same thing with available information now, which is data at the end of 2014, and look at the change in the rankings? And what happens is that the indicator doesn't give me too much comfort about Latin America. 4 of the 6 Latin American countries have deteriorated their position in the ranking. Is not as resilient as it used to be, and this is not only in relative terms, but when you analyze each of the component of the index separately. And basically, you can conclude that there are 2 sub-regions in Latin America in terms of resilience, right? With Chile, Colombia, Peru, and increasingly Mexico, but increasingly not there yet, remaining in good standing, but Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela quite fragile if a new shock were to emerge. An important result is that 2 of the BRICS in the sample, I don't have Russia because the numbers in Russia, but we don't have to talk about Russia. We know Moody's just downgraded Russia. But 2 of the BRICS, Brazil and India, worsened the relative position. So when we are talking again, those countries that were supposed to be the leaders and into the emerging market class, we should be concerned. But in particularly that Latin America, among them, is the region that have been most exposed. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I am delighted to be here with respected colleagues in this panel and also very good friends. The presentation which is coming here follows a little bit on what Liliana was saying and starts moving, stays in the macro, but it will, I think, pre-announce some of the micro things that Santiago Levy will discuss. The motivating issue is what Liliana was mentioning. Let's see if we can get this done. Is that we're back to low growth. That's Latin America before the magnificent years of the 2000s. And as you see, we're basically back to zero in some sense. Latin America is confronted again with the traditional Latin American problem. It's low growth. And we got a bit of an excitement in the last 10 years that now seems to be disappearing. So if I run out of time, I want to write here the main points I'd like to leave with you, the main messages of this presentation. which is work that I'm doing with analysts, and it's in some sense work in progress. First, we find in the data, as well as in the concepts, that growth is not just about supply. Economists like to think of long-term growth essentially as a supply-side issue, where growth is driven by investment prospects and profits. And who finances those investments, economists tend to think, it doesn't matter. Whether it's financed by foreign savings or local savings, it should not matter. That's the traditional view of economists. What we're essentially saying is that whether you finance your investment in growth with foreign or domestic savings matters, and it has an impact on growth. And it matters through three main channels, and I'll explain them a little bit later. First, low savings, which is a demand component. Low savings affects growth through the competitiveness channel. Low savings tends to reduce the competitiveness of your real exchange rate, and that has effects on growth, and I'll explain this a little bit. Second, low savings, by creating current account deficits, which Liliana mentioned, can begin to produce vulnerabilities for the balance of payments. And the more the vulnerability in the balance of payments happen, the more the risk premium the country will have to pay will rise. And so low savings can have an effect on growth via balance of payments sustainability effects. And third, savings can also affect growth because we know, as a matter of fact, that savings goes up as growth happens. But once growth and savings are correlated, then savings will have an additional multiplier effect on growth through the channels that I mentioned earlier. So we explore these three channels through which low savings can affect growth, and I'll give you some of the results. This view is dissonant with the mainstream economic literature, because in the mainstream, let's take a neoclassical traditional growth model. What those models tend to imply is that saving does not matter for the equilibrium real exchange rate, and it doesn't matter for growth. That savings, domestic and foreign savings, tend to be substitute. In fact, the neoclassical growth model predicts that the more you grow, the less you save, because the prospects of being richer in the future make you save less. So that way of thinking is inconsistent with well-established observations. And part of what we're doing is trying to see how we reconcile theory with observations in this regard. This is a long debate, and I'm not going to get into this. You have a paper for that. It's a long debate. But I think if you want to look at the pieces of the debate, it goes more or less like that. Nobody questions the fact that savings and growth go together. Countries that save more grow more. Countries that save less grow less. We know that. There's plenty of evidence of that. We also know that countries that save more invest more. That's the Feldstein-Horioka puzzle, right? He wonders why is it that the investment is not financed more by foreign savings, given capital mobility. So we know the correlation exists, but there's a huge debate as to which impacts what. What's the direction of causality? And I think it's fair to say that most economists think that savings, rather than causing growth, actually follows growth. So I'm going to make the reverse argument. I'm going to say, of course, savings follows growth, but also it causes growth through the channels that I was mentioning before. This is important to reconcile because when you talk to policymakers, they have the sneaky feeling, which I think is correct, that low savings and therefore large current account deficits are bad for your health. They sooner or later will undermine growth. Policymakers know that in their heart, and yet when they read traditional economics literature, they don't find an echo to their beliefs. So by doing this, I think what we're finding in this research is that by thinking that once you posit that saving affects growth, you have to accept that foreign and domestic savings are not substitutes. Deep down, the reason why foreign domestic savings are not perfect substitutes is the same reason of what you will see when Santiago speaks. You see in the world huge dispersion of productivities between countries and across firms within the country. Neoclassical theory would say that factors would move to their best uses so that the productivity of factors would tend to equalize across firms and across countries. We know that that's not the case. We don't observe the equalization of factor productivity across firms and across countries. So this is an important point, because what I'm going to tell you, in a sense, provides a link between macro, why does saving matter, and micro, why do we have such huge and persistent dispersions in productivity. So I have a set of arrows and things like that to try to explain the three channels, which I'm not going to show you because you can read that at your leisure. So I'm going to try to give you the intuition of the three channels through which low savings can affect growth. First, the competitiveness channels. How does it work? Well, low savings means that that expenditure is exceeding income. So when aggregate demand exceeds income, some of that demand goes into imports. But if you're a small country, you can import at a given international prices. The price of import doesn't change because a country is importing more. However, the excess demand over income, when it falls on domestic goods, it raises the prices of domestic goods. And that's precisely what the real appreciation is. Now, once the real appreciation has happened, if factors don't move fast enough, which is what the micro evidence tell us, then the equilibrium real exchange rate will be lasting. So a low savings will appreciate the exchange rate, and that appreciation will last for a while, and that will undercut growth through a competitiveness channels. Why? Because an appreciated real exchange rate will make people invest more and do more activity in the non-tradable sector instead of in tradable industries. And we have this sneaky feeling that tradable industries are better conduit to learn, for investment, for technology diffusion. And so to the extent that tradable sector generates more learning externalities, more investment impetus, and more learning by investment externalities, then you lose growth potential by specializing in non-tradables. That is the competitiveness channel. The interest rate, what we call the interest rate channel, which is the sustainability channel, works the reverse. In the first case, what you would expect is that if this competitive channel is dominating, you will see countries that save less, grow less, and have an overvalued exchange rate. That's what you would see if that channel dominates. The interest rate channel works slightly differently. You save less, your current account deficit becomes bigger, you start financing, you start borrowing, but as you borrow more, you begin to have higher risk of default. And so the country risk may go up if people think that this is not sustainable, that your current account deficits are not sustainable. That will raise risk premium, a country risk premium, therefore that will raise the cost of capital and will bring down investment. If the sustainability problems materialize and you have a crisis, the crisis will by itself undercut growth. So when this interest rate channel dominates, low savings will be associated with low growth, but the exchange rate in this case would be undervalued because the sustainability problems will make your exchange rate to be rather weak. And so where the interest rate channel dominates, you'll have a different pattern. You have low savings, low growth, but undervalued real exchange rates. And the third channel is the one that I mentioned, growth leads to different savings rates. And once the saving rate changes, it affects growth through the channels that I mentioned. So those are the three channels. That's the intuition, and this is the little graphs that help that. Bottom line, when you run the regressions and you look at the data, and we have been looking at the data until we're blue in our faces, what you find are some important results. First, the effect, we do in effect find that low savings lead to low growth. Longer term, not just in the short run, longer term, lead to lower growth. Let's see if I can show you this. This effect seems to be much higher for middle income countries. This is possibly because the reason why low savings affect growth is because there is insufficient factor mobility. Maybe as countries become better markets and more developed, there's more factor mobility, so these effects lose power as you go into a richer country. So it's mainly a middle income effect. And it seems asymmetric. So low savings affects growth more when you tend to be in current account deficit territory, the bigger your current account deficit is. So the more you're in surplus, then the marginal benefits of saving more are not as high. And when you look at impacts, we are trying to detect impacts by instrumenting these variables because there's so much endogeneity in this data. But when you try to instrument, we have been successful in instrumenting to some extent this, and you get big impacts. So if Latin America would raise the saving rate to be equal to those of Asia, the saving rate in Asia, we can get that around 1 to 2 additional points of growth, given the data. So let me show you a little bit of the data. This is okay, I need to explain this graph a little bit. So in this graph, you have the savings along the vertical axis, and does this work? No. Each dot is a country in a period. Since we're looking at long-term growth, long-term relations, each period is an average of 3 years. Okay, so I have to finish very quickly. So what you see is that in the sample as a whole, on average, in the world, you see this pattern. Countries that oversave, that are above the horizontal axis, and countries that are that oversave tend to have an exchange rate that is undervalued, and they grow more. So you want to know exactly what happens in each of these areas. I'm done. So there's no way I can show you all of these results, but I want to tell you a little bit of the main messages for Latin America. So when you look at this data and you see where Latin America has been, this is a story you can tell. In the 90s and in the 80s, low savings in Latin America led to low growth, mainly through the interest rate channel. It made our balance of payments less viable, more vulnerable. We had a lot of financial crisis, and that's how low savings affected growth. In the last 10 years, however, Latin America has become a better asset class, like Liliana was mentioning. And therefore, what happens with our balance of payments has become more resilient. But our exchange rates have appreciated a lot in the last 10 years. So low savings may be now affecting Latin America's growth more now, to the extent that our balance of payments remain viable. Low savings will be affecting Latin America more through the external competitiveness channel. What that means is that we have a huge and very complicated policy issue. You see, now, as Liliana was saying, we need to adjust to the external situations. And that means that we need to play well with our macro policy. What these type of results are telling us is that the best way to adjust would be tightening the fiscal and loosening the monetary, because tightening the fiscal will create a more robust saving environment that would help long-term growth. Loosening the monetary, as you tighten the fiscal, will allow a lower interest rate and investment will pick up. Now, that is what the doctor orders. It would be consistent, it would make consistency between the short run and the long run. However, politics are against that. Politics are in favor of what Liliana was saying. Let's borrow. Markets are liquid. They are willing to take our bonds. So we may, in that process, continue to create this bias for either lower competitive real exchange rates or perhaps vulnerable balance of payments. So if we don't adjust well to this cycle, we will be undercutting our capacity to grow in the future by either one of the two channels. Doing this well is, however, monstrously difficult because you have to do a fiscal effort, and that's not popular. And somebody has to consume less today so that savings can raise and you can get this trick. And that is plagued with tensions. So, basic point. Let us not forget about macro. Aggregate demand management not only matters for short-run cyclical fluctuations, it also matters for long-term growth. Doing the things right in the short run will matter for what happens long-term growth. The additional kick is that you do a more saving effort today, even your counter-cyclical policy will be better in the future because countries that save more can do better also in the short run in counter-cyclical policy management. One final point. Growth will be at the core of the discussion in Latin America going forward. And Latin Americans are not very good at discussing growth. But as we go to the We are learning in the World Bank now that as we prepare for the next annual meetings in Lima, which will happen in 4 decades, I think it's the first time we have annual meetings of World Bank and IMF in Lima, we are finding out that the demand is for discussions of growth and how to link short-term to long-term growth issues. So the World Bank has opened a hashtag that's called Road to Lima or Rumbo a Lima. And the idea of this hashtag is to try to promote a conversation on the real issues that Latin America needs to discuss for the future. And I almost bet that growth will be at the center. Thank you.
So, good morning to everybody. First, let me thank the Center for Global Development for hosting the event, and particularly Liliana for doing the organizing, but mostly all of you for coming here, particularly in such a cold day. So, I'm going to look at the other side of the coin of what Augusto was looking at. I'm going to look at growth from the point of view of productivity. Since time is really short, I'm going to go a little bit quickly. This is a very sad graph. This is a graph of half a century. And what it tells, the blue line, is that in half a century, Latin America has not closed the income gap vis-a-vis the United States. That's the blue line. So relative to the United States, the per capita income of Latin America today is exactly the same as 50 years ago, zero convergence. The green line says that Latin America has accumulated more physical capital and has accumulated more human capital relative to the United States. So it's kind of a puzzle. Why is it that if you have accumulated more physical capital and human capital, you have converged zero? And the answer is the red line. The red line says productivity in Latin America relative to productivity in the United States has been dismal. It's actually lower today than it was half a century ago. Contrast that with Korea. What Korea did, not only did it close the income gap, it closed it by a big shot. That's the blue line. They also accumulated quite a bit of physical and human capital, but what's really important is that productivity for Korea, they closed the gap vis-a-vis the United States, whereas Latin America actually widened the gap vis-a-vis the United States. So the lag vis-a-vis the United States of Latin America is completely due to productivity. We've actually saved more than the Americans, invested more than the Americans, and in relative terms, educated our people more than the Americans. Korea's spectacular development is partly due to the fact that their TFP did really well, but also that they, and this is Augusto's point, they saved a lot more and they invested a lot more. So if you take away short-run macro management issues, the other side of the coin that I want to emphasize in this talk is that by and large, if you look at a very long-term period, the growth problem of the region has been a productivity problem. And as Augusto was mentioning at the end, now that growth is back because the rest of the world is not pulling us, the productivity agenda, in my view, is going to be central to the growth agenda of Latin America. So I want to tell you 3 stories about productivity. How do we understand productivity? Why that red line? I mean, it's a complete puzzle, number one, and it's extremely sad. So why? So the first story is a story that says, look, Latin America misallocates human capital and physical capital. The markets in Latin America work really badly. The aggregate factor productivity of a country is just the aggregate of the productivity of all the firms weighted by how much capital and how much labor each firm puts together, right? So what it says is in Latin America, there are big obstacles for resources to flow to their more productive uses. And I'm going to use the word distortions with quotes because these obstacles need not only be distortions in the traditional sense, it might also be market failures, whatever you want. But they're impediments for resources to flow to the more productive uses. So it tells that what's behind that A function, the total factor productivity, is very complex, and we don't really understand fully what's going on behind that A function. But it says it's affecting the intensive margin and the extensive margin. What do I mean by this? People who should not be entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs, and they're running firms. People who should be entrepreneurs are working, but they don't have access to capital, so they can't run firms. So the wrong people are doing the wrong things. And in addition, firms have the wrong sizes. many very small firms, and then large firms are perhaps larger than they should be. So both the extensive margin and the intensive margin are fixed. Physical and human capital could themselves be a function of all these distortions. That's the point that Augusto was making. And it says that removing all these distortions or these market failures could have a very, very large payoff because resources would flow to the more productive uses. So here's a little bit of evidence. This is the United States. And this compares what is the difference in the same sector. We're not comparing apples and pears here. In the same sector, what is the difference in the productivity of 1 peso of capital and labor in a firm, in a sector between the firm in the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile? In the United States, there's a little bit of a difference. But if you look at the rest of Latin American countries, what it basically tells you is, for reasons that we don't fully understand, take automobiles, take textiles, take food processing, take any sector, the same firms coexist, but the differences between the high productivity firms and the low productivity firms are very large. So this is a really pretty picture that it took us about 2 years to put together. It's you know, if you get excited about this, you're about as nerdy as I am, but I get very excited about this. What this tells you is this. This is the US, dotted, comparing only apples with apples at the 4-digit level. And it says in the United States, the more productive firm is about 4 times more productive than the average firm, and the least productive firm is about 1/16th least productive than the average firm. That's the United States. So it's not a perfect neoclassical world. There's dispersion. They should all be compressed in the middle, but there's some differences. This is Mexico. In Mexico, the more productive firm is 16 times more productive than the average firm, and the least productive firms is about 1/1000th least productive than the most productive firm. So if you ask yourself why, if you look at the sizes of firms, what you find is there's a huge number of very unproductive firms that are very small, has to do with the issues of informality and the issues that labor markets don't function well and the credit markets don't function well. So what this says is you're losing a huge amount of productivity because you're misallocating and your markets are working very badly. Second story is the human capital story. Is productivity is really bad in Latin America because we educate our children badly and our schools don't work very well and the PISA scores, we all know the story. I sort of believe that story, but it's a puzzle and a research question, a really interesting question. Why, if really human capital is so scarce, are the returns to skill falling at the top of the distribution? So that's so it puts some questions as to whether that's really the story that you tell. And then the story number 3 is a little bit the story that in some way Augusto was saying, which is, look, people think that productivity is itself a function of how much you're investing. And this is the view that even most policymakers have, which is you really have to invest a lot because investment will come with this new machinery, these new technologies, and that's what's going to raise productivity. And that's what policymakers have in mind. This is Cambridge flavor from the 1960s and 70s, Caldor, sort of large economies of scale in manufacturing, and there's emphasis on infrastructure and stuff like that. It's more of a macro story. Some evidence that that's not the case in Latin America. So this is what is the change in productivity as a function of investment. And yes, in the advanced economies, that's kind of sort of a positive looking line. In the Asian economies, that's sort of a positive looking line. But very puzzling, in Latin America, that's a negative looking line. So it says it's not only a matter of accumulating physical capital, because you're accumulating a lot of physical capital, but something else is going on, because despite the fact that you're accumulating more physical capital, productivity is actually falling. So you're investing in the wrong firms or in the wrong sectors. So it's not a story about accumulating more physical capital and just investing more and saving more. It really, in my view, supports the story that there's a lot of misallocation going on here. So I'm short for time. What do I think, looking as a growth agenda, as Augusto was saying, what does the region really needs to do? I think the first thing it needs to do is it has to understand why there's so many obstacles for resources to flow to their more productive uses. There's a huge amount of misallocation, a lot of waste going on in the region relative to other regions of the world. And secondly, it needs to invest much more in human capital. The first task will read a lot of results, will yield positive results. And it might actually be very important because I have the hypothesis that in fact the returns to education in Latin America and the returns to skill in Latin America are actually being depressed by all the misallocation because you don't have the firms out there that are demanding all the human capital that are actually forming. So what does task do one? What does it really mean and why is it so difficult to do it? Because it would really take a systematic revision of all the regulations and the policies and the programs and ask yourself the question, does policy X contribute to resources flowing to their more productive use? Does our labor programs do that? Do our social programs do that? Do our social insurance programs do that? Do our taxations do that? And it's a very big task. There are many X's. And there's a lot of research done at the World Bank, at the IDB, by many academics out there that says for many of these questions, the answer is no. Our taxation system is not allowing resources to flow to more productive use. Our labor systems is not doing it. Our social insurance system is not doing it. In fact, there's a lot of recent research that says it's actually doing the opposite. It's actually pushing it into the more inefficient uses. So this is very difficult to do because behind all these institutions and all these programs and policies, there are deeply rooted social arrangements on taxation, on social insurance, on labor market policies, strong ideological beliefs, and a lot of disagreement. So we don't really have a consensus about that. There's a lot of evidence accumulated over the last 10 years that if you take almost anything, severance pay, non-contributory social programs, taxation, this taxation of small firms, and you go one by one, and the answer is almost systematically, this is not contributing to resources flowing to their more productive use. This is contributing to widening the differences in productivities across firms and across sectors, and is producing all these losses of productivity. What would the second task do? The second task would say, look, you have to think of human capital beyond schooling. We worry a lot about this, and there's a huge amount of research going on in this part. But actually, for the next 10 years, for the next 15 years, what goes on here is basically irrelevant. For the next 15 years, growth is really what happens here. Because there's the stock of workers that you already have in the labor force and the extent to which they can improve their skills or not. Education will matter, yes, I'm not putting it down, I'm all for good education, but education is not going to make any difference in terms of the growth pattern of Latin America for the next 10 years, and ECD will not do it either. I'm not against it, all for it. But for the next 10, 15 years, this is where the action is. And this is where you have to worry about. And that goes back to the misallocation story. Are firms training their workers? Are workers getting on-the-job training? Are they acquiring skills? Are they adapting new technologies? So let me begin to close because I'm running out of time. Raising productivity in the region is going to be very, very difficult. No silver bullet, no magic wand. Somebody wants the magic reform, the telecom reform, voila. The energy reform, tomorrow will be Switzerland, voila. No such thing. It's going to be a long haul of accumulating very many reforms to be able to do it. Can't do it without good macro, but if macro is bad, it's very difficult to do it. You have to rethink a lot, and in my view, the region has to go through something very painful, which is to rethink a whole bunch of redistribution instruments that it's been using, particularly those that bear on the labor market, that are part of the many disallocations that are going on here. There's very much country to country, and it needs a lot of pragmatism. And this is a scarce commodity in a very, very ideological region in which people look at the world through very ideological lenses. What do I need to mean by expelling Penelope from Macondo? 30 seconds. In Ulysses, the Odyssey, Penelope is a wife who's waiting for Ulysses to come back from Troy, and she has all these people that want to marry her, and what she does is says, well, look, when I finish knitting this blanket, I'll marry you. And during the day she knits, but during the night she unknits. So with one hand in Latin America, we do reforms to do productivity, and then with the other hand we turn around and we do a whole bunch of policies to undo what we're doing to do productivity. we have a complete chaos in terms of policy making, in terms of social insurance, in terms of labor market, taxation, it's complete chaos. So we need a systematic approach. And at the end of the day, what I really think is productivity is a reflection of the institutions, policies, and programs that countries have. I think what makes the difference between Asia and Latin America is that their institutions and their social agreements and their social understandings have been much more conducive to productivity. They've been much more pragmatic. They've separated the distribution issues in a better way. We haven't been able to do that. And Latin America will have to go through a difficult period of reflection if it really wants to grow again, and if it doesn't want to do it by sweat, but some by inspiration and by productivity changes. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Right. So I'm going to be the adjustment variable as the last speaker. But anyway, thank you, CGD. I'm a non-resident fellow here, so I feel part of it. And thank you very much, Liliana, for putting this together. It's amazing that we have such a good crowd, because in DC it's always very hard. And actually, the three presentations that preceded me are a great segue to my discussion. Do I have to do anything here? It will just pop up. Because I'm going to talk about what to expect. I have the clicker. And when I click, what happens? All right. I think you have copies of the presentation. I'm going to talk about, right now what we heard is a little bit depressing, because we heard that growth is slowing down and that the factors that are behind this are very hard to change. I guess there's one optimistic side to the story of Latin America in the last couple of decades, is that at least we are not so prone to crisis, and probably that's not going to happen again, except with a few country exceptions that are doing things really bad. No? So that's a good news. And I'm going to be talking about another part that has been good news in the region and whether these good news will continue. So I'm not going to do it as technically as you guys did it, but the papers are there, and if you have questions, I'm very happy to discuss them. So we have good news in the last 2 decades in Latin America, and particularly in the 2000s. Economic growth and declining inequality led to two important changes in terms of the social makeup of the region. Poverty was reduced substantially, and also the middle class was expanded. So there's this graph that, by the way, I cite the sources. So if you want to use these graphs, you can cite them as well. And I can share the papers. They're not out yet. They're going to be published, but I'd be happy to share them. So you can see here that, poverty, which was around 42% in the beginning of the 2000s, reached about 25%, and the middle class went from 22% to about 34%, right? So this is, and how do we define the middle class? I'm using the definition that the World Bank has adopted between $10 PPP a day and $50 PPP a day, which has also been adopted by CGD because Nancy Birdsall came up with the $10 threshold as well per day. No? Okay, so the big question is, was this due to growth or redistribution? Because both happened during the last decade. And we did some decomposition exercises. Well, first of all, please see that the decline in inequality, the redistribution, happened practically in all the countries. The ranking may change depending on the source you use, depending on which year you take as a starting year and the end year, but the graph always looks the same, la escalerita. No? So in terms of poverty, when you apply some typical standard decomposition exercises, you obtain that on average. It varies between countries, but on average, about 61% of the decline in poverty is accounted for growth, and about 39% by redistribution. A decline in inequality, which is a very large size when you compare what used to happen before. In terms of the rise of the middle class, growth, the growth component, which is the orange one here, was about 79%, and redistribution, the decline in inequality, 21%. So again, redistribution played a role, less than poverty reduction as expected, but it was there. So I guess, we heard what accounted for growth. So what accounted for the decline in inequality? And I think in the story as it goes now, there were three main forces in the direction of making inequality lower. One is the decline in inequality in labor markets associated to a decline in the skill premium, wages of people with higher skills versus people with lower skills were declining in relative terms. There were larger and more progressive transfers targeted to the poor. And there are also expansion of private transfers, particularly remittances in some countries that played an important role. So some of the exercises that we've done quantitatively, this is what they look like. So labor income, what happened to inequality in labor income is the bulk of the story of why inequality declined. Government transfers is the orange, private transfers is the yellow. Okay, so now we are in more challenging times, and we heard from the three speakers that preceded me that growth is not going to look good. Already we have observed much lower growth. Augusto said that we're almost in zero. So we want to ask the question, okay, so what will happen to poverty and the expansion of middle class will primarily be dependent on what happens to inequality, because we know that growth is already going to do not much for it. So what do we expect from it? So I'm going to have a speculative exercise here in terms of what to expect in terms of changes in income inequality. Will inequality increase, stay the same, or decline? And I'm just going to be able to share with you the forces that are in play, and in the end, the one that dominates is going to be the one that tells the story. So what are the forces in place? First, inequality, this is the average for the region, and it seems that it was petering out here at the bottom. But if you take Mexico out, actually the decline continues throughout the year in which we have data. So there doesn't seem to be a slowdown up to 2012. But what can we expect will happen with labor earnings, government transfers, and private transfers? So I think that in terms of labor earnings, we're going to have lower labor demand because of slower growth, and there's going to be a requirement, a need to introduce fiscal consolidation because of the reasons that were explained before by Liliana, by Augusto, and to some extent also by Santiago. So market-determined wages at the bottom, I think, are going to either grow more slowly, not at all, or even decline, depending on the country. On the other hand, because of fiscal consolidation, we would expect also the real minimum wages, which affect also what happens to the spending of the government, because minimum wages affect their wage bill, also will not continue to rise, I would expect. Wages of the skilled workers also may fall, because without growth, the demand for them also will be lower. So in the end, the net effect will depend, fall or grow more slowly. It will depend on which of the two forces dominates, what happens at the bottom or what happens at the top. In terms of government transfers, with most countries facing the fiscal constraints that are much tougher than before, I think that transfers definitely will not continue to expand. And they will not, I mean, if they expand, they will not continue to be the equalizing force they were in the past. I think that some countries may even have to cut the generous transfers. And also in other countries, it will be eroded directly by inflation, the ones like we know where inflation is high. So that force also is going to be for sure in the negative in terms of what will be the impact on inequality. The only bright spot may be private transfers, because with the US recovery, we may see actually more demand for labor migrants and good wages for them, and remittances may continue to play an equalizing role. in the countries where they're important, which is primarily in Central America, because they're important for Mexico, but not in relative terms. But in Central America and some Caribbean, they play a very important role. So I have 2 minutes, and I have a thank you. So the bottom line, I made it very short because I knew that it was going to be tough. So the bottom line is that the dynamics of inequality in the future are going to be key to know what happens to the progress we saw in the past decade in terms of poverty reduction and the expansion of middle class. The dynamics of inequality will depend on what happens in labor market inequality, and that we cannot predict because it will depend on how the slower growth will affect wages at the bottom vis-a-vis wages at the top. Ex ante, that will vary by country maybe, and ex ante, we don't know what the outcome will be. We know that private transfers might be continue to play an equalizing role, and we know that public transfer will be cut down or at least will not play the important role they played in the past in terms of reductions in inequality and poverty. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers for 4 very informative and thought-provoking presentations, and a great display of how the presentations flowed from one to each other, built on the previous presentation and took us to a new area, from macro to micro, as per the title. I'm going to invite the speakers back onto the stage now so that we can spend the rest of the time taking questions from the audience. We have a couple of microphones, a couple of our staffers with the microphones. I'm going to ask for questions per section, really. Let's take 3 at a time. So please put your hands up if you have questions to ask, and then let's see where we go from there. Okay, ma'am, why don't you start? Let me just take this question down. Would you like to introduce yourself? And
I'm Teresa Terminacian, formerly from the IMF. I have 2
The
questions.
micro is not.
are the microphones on?
Yeah, it is on. I have two questions, one for Santiago and one for Nora. For Santiago, you know that I very much share your views on the importance of productivity and correcting the sort of distortions that affect the productivity. But I think in a number of Latin American countries, particularly the ones that are large and sort of territorially, infrastructure are a really important bottleneck. So, and I mean, I think your chart does not really refer to the impact of infrastructure on growth, but more to the impact of the capital stock. I don't know if measured. I mean, it can involve a lot of also, you know, poor investment on total factor productivity. So I think that the story that you are telling is a very compelling one, but it should be a little bit more qualified to recognize the importance of effort, which links again to the saving story of Augusto. The second, the point with Nora is, one is a factual question. Do your transfers include taxes? I mean, is it net transfers from the government, or is it sort of just the social expenditure? And second, I think that, you know, your story is a bit too negative. I mean, there is a scope for policy improvement, both in terms of redirection or changes in spending, the composition of spending to sustain good social programs, and also there is scope for improving the composition of taxes, as the IDB book of a couple of years ago emphasized, particularly in terms of the role that direct taxes can play.
Can I just clarify the actual question to Senor Levy? Was it actually a question?
No, it was more like a commentary, really, on his
But I know what her question is.
Okay. So, Senor Levy, would you like to respond to that question, the point about bottlenecks regarding infrastructure?
Point well taken. On the comparison between Korea and Latin America, it's the capital stock, private and public. It's the sum total of capital stock. In the productivity comparisons between the United States and the other countries, is firm level capital. So you're hiding there the infrastructure. But the point is well taken. Clearly, part of the productivity gains is having a good functioning infrastructure, and the lags between Latin America and Korea and Asia in general are substantive. So,
Professor Lustig, your story was too negative.
Yeah, let me first respond to the question whether it's tax and transfers net of taxes. So these decompositions are usually done using disposable income. So it's net of direct taxes, but not net of consumption taxes. In fact, when we add consumption taxes to the story, in some countries, the transfers are not large enough to compensate what the poor pay. And in my other work, which I didn't present today, we show that in several countries in Latin America, poverty after taxes and transfers, including the consumption taxes, is higher than market poverty for a wide range of poverty lines, okay? So we can't do it the way you would like to see it, because then they would have to use a different measure of income that most of these countries do not have in the surveys, okay? The second thing about, I do agree that, I mean, I don't mean that we don't have any scope, but I think that most countries are going to find it very hard for political reasons also to find a way to actually to continue expanding the transfers by redirecting transfers from other places and restructuring the taxes. On the contrary, I think that the taxes are going to be increased. The taxes are probably going to increase poverty. I think that we're going to continue to rely on taxes that are more easy to collect and not necessarily use the mechanisms to compensate the poor for the losses. So my story could even be more negative from what I anticipate. And you know, one thing I want to say, Teresa, I wish you are right. I mean, because my commitment is to equity, like my project says, and I would like to see that actually during austere times, countries continue to be able to actually protect the poor from the brunt of the cost.
Let's get a couple more questions. I know this gentleman over here, first of all. Stand up, sir, and then introduce yourself, and then let's take your questions.
John Lipsky from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I don't mean this as in any way a criticism of the presentations, but if you'd been sitting in a class, say 45 years ago at Stanford University, discussing these issues, it would have sounded very much similar. The difference would have been you would have had Ed Shaw and Ron McKinnon saying the problem is, or one of the key problems here is financial repression, and they would have gone on to write books, financial deepening and economic development, et cetera. I was a little surprised. Liliana mentioned sources of finance, but it didn't enter into, the financial system didn't enter into the other presentations. Is that because you feel that the distortions in current financial systems in Latin America are not important in the context of savings and productivity? Or is it because the distortions are not important relative to these other factors that you did discuss? Thanks.
Let's see if there's any more questions first before we get that to answer. You, sir, over here. If you could just, we'll get a microphone to you. If you could just introduce yourself. Here it comes.
I'm Danny Leipziger from GW. I have two questions. Augusto, on the policy mix you recommend, I'm not sure, despite the regression analysis, that I agree with it. Tightening up on fiscal now in a lot of Latin American countries and loosening monetary policy seems at odds with what's happening both internally and externally. It's at odds externally because the Fed's going to raise interest rates, so you want more capital to flow out. Not a good idea. Secondly, we know that the responsiveness of investment to the interest rate may not be very great when you have these poor growth prospects. So I don't really like that recommendation. And on the fiscal side, I think a lot of the Latin American countries have fiscal space, and in the short term, they may want to use it slightly. So that would be my question for you. And for Santiago, I mean, I love your graph. I hope I can borrow it with attribution. The dilemma is the following. So firms are the wrong size, and they're the wrong shape, and they do the wrong things. So that sort of leads you to a view on industrial policy, because the market is not producing, there may be some distortions, but it's not producing the right kind of industrial configuration. So then you look at countries that try to change it. Take Brazil. They confiscate labor taxes, so it's in Nora's world of redistribution the wrong way. They send it to BNDES, and it gives the money to relatively large, but relatively perhaps unproductive or uncreative firms. So they try, but they don't succeed. So what's the suggestion that you would make for countries to change the shape of that graph?
Okay. Let's start off with Mr. Lipsky's question, which seemed to be to everyone except Liliana, really, I think. He was saying that your presentation sounded like they could have been made 45 years ago.
No, not mine.
I think, Professor Lustig, you're taking issue with that point straight away, so why don't you start?
He didn't talk about distribution at all.
I can probably take John's question. So what you see here is misallocation. But there's nothing here that tells you whether this misallocation is coming from the credit markets or the labor market or taxation or the lack of infrastructure. You have to dig deeper. The only thing we showed here is misallocation. And the relative weights of how much this is due to credit market problems versus labor market problems probably varies from country to country. It's not a homogeneous story. So this is consistent with the view that you might have financial repression or misallocation of credit, because the government credit programs, microcredit, whatever, it's consistent with that, or with the story that it comes from the labor, misallocation broadly. I think Augusto wants to complement.
Yeah, just I think an important fact to complement your question is the following. When you look at the way financial systems have developed in Latin America compared to, say, Asia or Eastern Europe or other middle-income regions, what you see is that the development of the Latin American system has been very biased in favor of consumption. The part of credit that has grown the fastest and has gained share is consumption credit. So, and that makes the region different than others. So one can say that it does seem that the way in which our financial systems work are not particularly friendly to saving and to production, to asset building and to production. That is an interesting challenge because it's not clear what you can do at the level of regulatory policy, but it is a fact that we have systems that are not friendly to the saving production side of economic activity.
Yeah, I want to add something. I think that really there is, as they were saying, a complementarity between the presentations. The Latin American region is the most financially open region among developing countries in the world. Is the one that with least restrictions to the movement of capital flows. And that's what it makes it particularly important for analyzing the transmission of shocks. But there are two more characteristics of Latin America that links the macro to the micro. It's not only the most financially open, but it's also the most unequal in the world in terms of income distribution, but interestingly enough, it's also the most democratic, which means that actually, with all its failures among the developing world, is a region that actually have the voters say something and have pushings in the political arena more strong than in others. Mm-hmm. So when you mention that, you have a huge channel, a huge challenge, which is, okay, globalization can help you for growth, but also you have a lot of requests, demands from the population, which is very democratic, in an unequal society. So that's where you have all this puzzle that remains to be solved.
I'll say one sentence. In Stanford in the 1970s, you probably would not have had somebody talking about inequality and poverty.
Or globalization.
No, but I was in Berkeley in the 1970s, so I know.
Let's take Danny Leipziger's questions from GW University. Two to Augusto de la Torre. First of all, this tightening up of fiscal policy, a loosening of monetary policy, is that the right approach, especially given as the Fed is likely to raise interest rates? Do you want to take that question?
Yes, I love to disagree with Danny because he was my boss. And so I have to get back to him for making me work so much But no, this is how I see Danny and why I disagree with you. When you think from short-term macro in Latin America, you have to first understand what's the shock that we have. So we have had a shock that comes from deceleration in China and fall in terms of trade. Those are the main two shocks. So the main effect of the shock is creating an external disequilibrium. So what you see in Latin America is countries that are starting to experience a current account disequilibrium because of the external shock, but they still have high employment levels. So what is the way to deal with that situation? Clearly, if you expand the fiscal in this situation, you will worsen your external deficit, and you will push inflation even higher when we already are feeling inflation problems, despite the fact that we're not growing. So I think the right policy in this case is to do a lot of expenditure switching. You want to adjust the external disequilibrium without harming domestic employment and domestic output. To do that, you need the exchange rate to move. And to move the exchange rate, you need interest rates to fall. And for interest rate to fall without inflationary pressures, you have to tighten the fiscal. So I really think that for Latin America, contrary to what the US is preaching, and even the IMF is preaching that the world should be expanding aggregate demand because the world is in a slump, globally that may be true, but from the point of view of Latin American countries, what the doctor should order is you tighten the fiscal so that you help equilibrate the external deficit, and you loosen the monetary so that the exchange rate can shift resources to the local economy. That has the advantage as you tighten the fiscal that saving goes up and it helps you in the long run per the evidence that I was discussing. So that's how I see the conundrum for Latin America. And that's what you see happening. Brazil, for instance, has no choice but to do that. Now, Colombia may have a choice and they may be tempted to rather finance and with I think, adverse effects.
Yeah, and I want to add something that goes along the lines of Augusto. That is what countries in Latin America are doing now in terms of the monetary policy. All but Brazil. Yeah. Brazil can't because of the inflation, but they are all losing monetary policy. Why? Because they have the exchange rate now that can move. Differently from the 70s, the 80s, and even the early 90s, now the exchange rate can do part of the adjustment. And of course, some countries do more than the others. I'm thinking, Peru have the problem of dollarization, can do less, whatever. But the thing is that that's what countries are doing now. In expectation of bad shocks to come, they are actually doing countercyclical monetary policy. So the doctor is kind of right there.
The patient is responding.
There was another question from Mr. Leipziger for Santiago Levy. It was about the shape of your graph. Are you talking about the graph that showed the continued productivity gap? Is that the graph you're talking about? Yeah, the graph. Yeah. What can countries do to change the shape of that graph was the question.
So again, a little bit like, I didn't show here sort of what is the type of distortions that is causing such huge difference in productivity. My reading is that you have very badly functioning credit markets and very badly functioning labor markets. Taxation enters into that because the way you tax labor versus the way you tax firms and tax capital, and many programs that are actually contributing to distorting the allocation. Credit given to firms through these microcredit programs, or through development banks, credit given to very large firms that are unproductive and shouldn't be getting credit. So it can go both ways. You can be pushing too many small firms, and you can actually making unproductive firms larger than what they should be. What would be my preference to begin to correct all this? I'd be reluctant to think about the government trying to do this through industrial policy. I mean, selectively here and there with very strong institutions, it's, but by and large, I think what you're showing here is that across the board, the credit market and the labor market are not doing its job. And it's extremely unlikely that the government will going to be able to do it through selective interventions. So I would very much argue for thinking systemically as to what is this happening. When you see the size distribution of firms in Latin America, and you see what is happening over time to the size distribution of firms, what is really striking is how skewed it is compared to other countries. And this is not a human capital story. Because if you think about China in the 1980s or China in the 1990s, China in the 80s and the 90s didn't have more human capital than Latin America. Latin America has much more. But the size distribution of firms is completely different. So it's really what the markets are doing. And that's where I would work on.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for a couple of more short questions. Let's see this gentleman here. We'll just wait for the microphone. If you could just introduce yourself.
Jaime Lepines from the World Bank. To Ms. Rojas, just a question.
Yeah, speak up.
Just one question here in relation to the graph that you showed about the shift from syndicated loans into corporate bonds and what have you, and also links into the sustainability point of the channel that you were mentioning, Augusto. And that is, should we not wish for what we don't really want? I mean, there is a situation, and it's true in all of the emerging markets right now, where the maturity structures of what you can borrow is significantly shorter than what you can do in international markets. So to this extent, this has to be factored in. When we see the shift, and we do see going out for this kind of foreign capital to be able to supplement the lack of domestic savings, and this is also true from what I understand, even in emerging markets that have high levels of savings, that the maturity structures are systematically longer in the international markets than domestically. So is this not a productivity increasing, boosting element as well in the background?
Liliana?
Okay, I'll go quick into that. You know, I didn't show a graph on maturity structure. I have a paper coming up with somebody from the Bank of Spain. And yes, maturity increased, but now they are decreasing. But guess what? For Latin America and a number of countries, the redemption profile, meaning when the debt is actually when you have to pay the debt, is concentrated in 2015 to 2016. Isn't that terrible? Is it the worst time where you're supposed to, because, and that's where Latin America is. I mean, that's for the next paper.
Let's take one more quick question from someone down here.
Guillermo Alborta, I am an independent consultant for IDB and IMF. One of the issues that come out very much in the contemporary days is the subsidy for energy. And the subsidies for energy, it becomes with the issue of saying countries have to adjust fiscal because they have to adjust for these subsidies. My question and what I'm wondering around is, whenever we talk about this fiscal adjustment and put fiscal at the beginning of our adjustment, don't we start with the subsidies instead of switching the expenditures? Probably my question goes to Mr. De La Torre, in that idea of that the switching the expenditures is the prescription first. And the second thing, and the second part, and it's basically the other side of the coin, is these subsidies have a very big impact, probably in terms of distortions, in terms of the distribution of income. There are countries who really have serious problems with subsidies, and because they are, let's say, giving more share to the income to the higher classes of the distribution than to the lower classes. It's creating such a distortion that there are sectors who are producing very much less, and less. They're receiving more subsidy. I want your comments about those things.
Okay, so first of all, to Augusto de la Torre about energy subsidies as part of fiscal policy change.
Thank you for raising this point, because the problem with a budget is that there are so many dilemmas in fixing the fiscal process. In there, it's very hard to find spaces for win-wins. And this is a clear win-win. Because right now, when oil prices and fuel prices international are going up, this is the time where you can reduce the subsidy content. I think countries are starting to do that because the subsidy implies a wedge between the international prices and the domestic prices. So to the extent that countries keep the domestic price unchanged, the subsidy mechanically comes down. And it is providing some relief to the fiscal, and that effect is positive for the fiscal. And it is also positive distributionally, because as you say, the energy subsidies are well known for being incredibly regressive. They benefit people that have swimming pools and are fairly rich. So this is one very clear area where seizing the opportunity of these high oil prices, which is not necessarily good news for most countries, to reduce the subsidies has both saving effects and therefore growth effects, and also has positive distributional effects.
I'm going to jump in there very quickly. Just we have 1 minute left. Just get 30-second answer from one of the panelists, perhaps one of the two at the end, about the impact of subsidies on distribution of income.
Well, I think that there are two issues. If you take into account not just the first round effects, but the second round effect of energy subsidies, which affect the price of transportation, then it may not be equalizing to get rid of them. That's the first thing. But even if it is equalizing to get rid of them, the problem is that it will affect prices of goods that the poor buy. So you may have an impact on the poor. So if you decide to do that, and I am all in favor of getting rid of things that are transferring resources to the ones who don't need them, but I think that the design of this reform has to be done such that you have the compensatory mechanisms in place for the poor so that they don't get hurt by this change. And that usually doesn't happen. It's happening more than before, but it's usually a promise more than an implementation. It means you need to have the instrument and you need to have the budget allocation for the compensation when you introduce the reform.
Okay, panel, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists. From the end, Professor Nora Lustig, Santiago Levy, Augusto de la Torre, and our own Liliana Rojas Suarez. Thank you very much, panel. And thank you all for coming along to this latest event from the Latin American Initiative. Thank you very much.